Hey, how's it going, everybody? Before we get into today's video, I want to ask to see if you're subscribed real quick. If you're not, totally fine. It's free and it lets you know when we upload new stuff, and you know what it does. Without further ado. Ragnar sat at the edge of a cliff, his emerald-scaled tail coiled tightly around his torso. The individual segments of the tail's plates caught the dusky light as the tail's tip rested over his lap, supported by legs that swung freely past the cliff's edge. Below, the ground was distant, a flat ledge of unforgiving stone, ready to transform him into a puddle of red if he slipped. Unconcerned by this, Ragnar's gaze lingered on the valley below, a paradoxical haven of lush green where the galaxy's most ferocious beasts, the skippers, roamed freely, their easily startled natures inexplicably subdued by the presence of a single human. This human, more than just living among them, went so far as to hold the young beasts in his arms, playing with them while their terrifying parents watched. How that human managed it was a mystery Ragnar was desperately trying to solve, for those beasts were impossible to approach unless they were held captive. A single scent, noise, or even just his breathing would trigger their spatial defense, causing their eyes to shine purple as reality itself warped around them. What followed was either a giant rock materializing out of thin air above whoever dared to approach, or the skippers itself vanishing, rendering any attempt to get close completely futile. Ragnar lingered on the cliff for a moment longer, his amber eyes narrowing as he watched the distant human below cradling a young skipper, stroking its dark fur as if it were no more than a common pet. Frustration swelled within him. The scene defied everything he knew about these beasts. With a slow exhale, Ragnar shifted his gaze from the valley to the thick, weathered rope anchored at his side. It hung taut against the cliff's edge, frayed in places from countless ascents and descents, yet sturdy enough to endure his weight. He rose to his feet with a warrior wildness, stepping back from the cliff's edge with just the strength of his reptilian body, evident in the way his muscles stretched before gripping the rope. His claws curled around it as he descended, the ridges of his forearms tightening. The last few feet were the easiest part, the coarse rope sliding through his hands until he was close enough to the ground to release it. From twice his height, he let go, landing heavily on the solid earth below with more strength than grace. Dust rose around his feet, and the echoes of his landing faded. A smooth, silky voice poured into his ears like molten gold. "You should ask the human how he can approach those beasts in their habitat, Ragnar. If you don't, we might stay trapped on this planet forever," said Izora. He turned, his heart skipping a beat as his gaze shifted to the figure before him. Izora stood there, her yellow scales reflecting what remained of the dusk light. A feat in itself, considering how many days had passed since they last took a bath in the river. Ignoring the dirt on her feet, Izora's regal bearing was as striking as ever. Her emerald eyes and long limbs were graceful, synergizing with the curve of her tail to exude an aura of elegance even in this remote wilderness. She was the reason he had left everything behind, the concubine who had captured his heart and led him to defy imperial law. Together they had eloped, fleeing the oppressive domain of Emperor Graco. They had freed a captive skipper and ridden it through the endless void to this untamed, off-the-charts planet. After so many days of just watching the human from a distance, her eyes finally met his, their depths silently demanding that he swallow his pride and ask for help. Ragnar crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he bluntly asked, "Did you forget that we already tried that?" The human bolted the moment he saw us. His tail flicked in frustration before he added, "I'd wager that he hates all reptilians because of what Emperor Graco did to him. And honestly, I don't blame him." A pang of guilt struck him as the words left his mouth. Internally, Ragnar couldn't help but empathize with the human. The poor soul had been dragged into someone else's mess and separated from his kind because of Graco's actions. Now, just like them, the human was stranded on this uncharted planet, forced to seek a way back home through the help of the feral skippers. Izora tilted her head, her voice calm but insistent. "If we could capture him, make him listen, truly listen to our story, and understand that we aren't working with Emperor Graco, he might help us." Her golden eyes gleamed with determination as she stepped closer. "He's the key, Ragnar. If we can convince him to trust us, he could teach us to tame the skippers. And then, maybe we'd have a way off of this cursed world." Ragnar repeated her words unconsciously. Cursed world. The phrase stung in a way that he hadn't expected. He had sacrificed everything to free her from Graco's grasp, leaving behind his home and position to escape the Empire. Yes, they were burdened by the consequences of their escape, but they had food, water, plenty of supplies, and most importantly, they had each other. It wasn't perfect, far from civilization as they were, but for Ragnar, it wasn't enough to call this a cursed world. Nearly 100 days here had given him more good memories with Izora than he had ever thought possible. He met her sharp gaze and asked softly, "Do you truly hate being stranded with me on this planet?" Izora's eyes hardened momentarily before softening. In a quiet, almost apologetic tone, she murmured, "Why do you have to make this about you?" Ragnar's fist clenched at her reply, frustration bubbling to the surface. But before the tension could grow, she stepped closer and pressed her head against his chest. Her voice was gentle, but her words cut deep. "You shouldn't get mad at me because I don't share your fondness for living in a cave and sleeping on rocks." She paused and added in a more serious tone, "Besides, this planet is not a suitable place to raise a kid." Ragnar's eyes widened, his body stiffening as his voice trembled. "Does that mean that you—" Izora silenced him with a finger pressed lightly to his lips. Her eyes locked onto his, no longer sharp, but filled with apprehension and a trace of vulnerability. "Didn't the military school teach you what the single fun activity we can do on this planet causes, Ragnar?" The sight of her in this moment sent a jolt through him, a wake-up call to his very core. Two truths struck him instantly. First, he had been unfair in expecting her to accept this planet with the same ease that he did. And second, because of his pride, he hadn't truly tried his hardest to reach the human again. Somewhere deep within him, he realized he had selfishly hoped to stay here forever, relishing the challenges of this harsh environment with Izora by his side. Ragnar pulled her close, his arms enveloping her as his hands pressed against her back. Lowering his head to her ear, he whispered, "I'll find the human, Izora." His tail coiled protectively around her as he added, "I know where he sleeps. If I approach him at night, he might not run. He doesn't even have a light source." He was completely unprepared when he fled from Graco. Izora let the warmth of his embrace linger, the silence stretching between them as the tension ebbed away. After a moment, she finally spoke. "I'm coming with you," she said resolutely. "The only good thing I learned from my time with Graco was how to interact with other species. I can help." Ragnar shook his head firmly. "No." Izora's teeth edged forward, her mouth tightening as though they were readying for an argument, but Ragnar silenced her with a raised hand. "If things go wrong, if the humans or the skippers attack, it's easier for me to retreat alone. I've trained my whole life for confrontations like this." "But we make a good team and—" she began, but Ragnar cut her off. "Not this time," he said gently, placing a hand atop her head. He smiled softly, the tension in that expression giving way to reassurance. The argument settled into an uneasy silence, and Ragnar used the opportunity to enter the cave they had been calling home. The dark interior smelled faintly of earth and moisture, illuminated only by the bright but focused glow of a camp light he had brought with him before fleeing the civilization. He moved to the back where their supplies were stored, carefully gathering what he needed. His focus was on his night vision goggles, the small but invaluable translator device, and a single gun from the modest pile of weapons they had. As he secured the gun to his belt, his gaze lingered on a flashing gold bar tucked away with other stolen items stolen from Graco. He hesitated for a moment and then grabbed it. A gift, he reasoned, might go a long way in establishing some kind of cooperation with the human. Izora stood in the cave's shadows, watching his preparation in silence. Her emerald eyes followed his every move, but didn't question why he was taking some of the gold she had stolen from Graco before their escape. When Ragnar finally turned to leave, her voice broke the quiet. "Be safe," she said softly, the concern in her tone unmistakable. He glanced back at her, his expression softening. "I'll be back soon," he replied, before stepping out into the night. The forest swallowed him whole as he moved away from the cave, the towering trees quickly concealing him from Izora's sight. His focus shifted entirely to the path ahead, his mind replaying the landmarks he had memorized from the cliff. He navigated the twisting maze of trees as if it were second nature, his movements calculated and smooth, his claws barely brushing the undergrowth. The valley stretched wide under the darkening sky, the last traces of twilight fading into the dark blanket of night. Ragnar crossed it steadily, the cool air teeming with the sound of nocturnal life. As he climbed the small hill that marked his destination, the world around him seemed to quiet. Every step, every rustle of leaves underfoot felt magnified in the silence. He became acutely aware of every noise he made, his muscles taut as he prepared for the imminent encounter at the clearing ahead. Through the dense trees, a flicker of light caught his attention. It was a warm, steady glow. Firelight. Ragnar slowed his pace, crouching low as he approached. He took care to avoid the underbrush, moving with instinctive precision to ensure the human wouldn't hear him coming. Finally, he found a shrub at the edge of the clearing, its leaves blending well with the surroundings. Parting the foliage with his claws, he peered through. The clearing was bathed in golden light from a bright bonfire. At its center sat the human, perched on a small rock, holding a thick chunk of meat skewered on a stick. The flames crackled and snapped as he slowly rotated the stick, his face calm, almost serene in the fire's glow. Smoke curled lazily into the air, carrying the rich, savory scent of roasting flesh. Ragnar's pulse quickened. This was the perfect moment to approach. The human seemed relaxed, distracted by his cooking. But just as Ragnar prepared to step out, movement across the clearing caught his eye. Two enormous purple eyes snapped open in the darkness, and their ethereal glow seemingly locked directly onto him. A surge of fear coursed through Ragnar, cold and sharp, rooting him in place. In the brief moment of uncertainty, he wondered whether to run or stay. But before he could decide, the creature began to rise. Time seemed to freeze as its midnight black fur caught the golden glow of the firelight, shimmering faintly as it rose to its full, imposing height. Stepping forward, it towered over the human, its presence bending the light around it like a black hole. With just 2 casual strides, it positioned itself beside the human. Its massive form seemed to absorb light, nearly extinguishing the bonfire's glow. Ragnar braced himself, expecting chaos. But the human glanced at the beast only briefly, and then returned his attention to the roasting meat. He rotated the stick as if nothing had changed, this human's calm demeanor suggesting he was more worried about burning his meal than the towering skipper standing mere inches away. Ragnar froze as he heard the human's voice carry through the clearing, casual and unconcerned. The skipper's enormous eyes shifted from him to the human, and for a moment, relief washed over him. Maybe the creature hadn't spotted him after all. Fumbling quickly, Ragnar slipped the translator into his ear canal, eager to make sense of the human's words. The device clicked into place just as the human's casual voice was conveyed. All right. I know you're hungry, okay? No need to drool over my head again. Or else I'm not going to feed you until you skip realities and take me to that volcanic world with the hot springs again. Ragnar's mind reeled at the implications. Was the human actually considering using the skipper's godlike powers to take a bath? The absurdity left him stunned. His thoughts spiraling so fast he barely noticed that the skipper hadn't taken kindly to the human's threat. The massive creature's gaze alternated between the thick chunk of meat and the human, as if deliberating. Then, with an air of petulance, it extended its enormous tongue and licked not the roasting meat, but the human himself. The sticky drool from the tongue sent the human stumbling sideways, nearly falling from his rock. Ragnar's jaw dropped in shock as the human stood up abruptly, anger flaring in his every movement. Pointing a finger at the towering beast, he shouted, "Oh, you didn't!" Tossing the stick with the meat aside, the human yanked off his shirt, revealing a lean, muscular frame now glistening with saliva under the firelight. Locking eyes with the skipper, he raged on. "You frickin' fluffy furball! Look at what you've done! Bad boy! Bad!" The skipper simply turned its gaze aside, releasing a low snort as though it fully understood and ignored every word the human had said. Ragnar was completely unprepared for the comical display. His wide eyes locked in the bizarre interaction. His mind, trained for battle and survival, struggled to process what he was seeing. The absurdity was so overwhelming that he decided to retreat, unsure if he was losing his grip on reality. He needed to discuss this with Izora, if only to confirm that he wasn't going insane. Unfortunately, as Ragnar turned to leave, his foot landed on a small stick, and the sharp snap echoed in the silence. His blood ran cold as the light around him began to warp and bend in strange, impossible angles. Fear surged through his veins like fire, and when he glanced behind and saw the skipper's eyes glowing purple, his mind conjured the image of a massive rock materializing above him, ready to crush him. Ragnar tried to leap on the spot, but his belt snagged on a branch of the shrub. Panic overtook him as he tugged desperately, his movements frantic yet futile. His mind spiraled into despair, his thoughts flashing to Izora as he glanced upward at the vortex of distorted space forming above him. That's it, he thought, fumbling with his belt buckle. This is how it ends. A sharp coldness struck his body, freezing him in place. For a moment he wondered if this was what death felt like. Cold, sharp, and utterly consuming. Then the sensation turned wet. Before he could process the shift, a torrent of freezing water crashed down from above, slamming into him with the force of a river. The icy flood intruded into every part of his face, pressing his body against the ground with an unforgiving weight. His thoughts vanished, replaced by pure survival instinct as he struggled against the overwhelming deluge to avoid drowning. The water swept him along, dragging him across the ground, and time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every heartbeat was an eternity as his body fought against the current, the pressure relentless against his chest. And when the flow finally subsided, Ragnar lay motionless, barely registering his surroundings. His vision swam, his lungs burned, and his body trembled uncontrollably because of the cold. The only image in his mind was of his shaking arms pressed tightly against his chest, and the flattened remnants of the shrub around him, crushed by the water's sheer force. He didn't know where he was or what had just happened. All he could do was gasp for air. The memory of the vortex and the skipper's gaze seared into his mind. Ragnar lay coughing on the ground, his lungs burning as he expelled water from his body. Just as he regained enough awareness to realize he was still alive, his blurred vision cleared to reveal the face of the human hovering above him. The man stood there, staring down with an expression that was hard to read. Neutral, almost devoid of emotion, taking no visible pleasure in Ragnar's suffering. The human's eyes widened as he stooped down and picked something up off the ground. "A gun?" he muttered, turning the weapon over in his hands before fixing his gaze back on Ragnar. His voice was calm, but carried a sharp edge. "You lizards won't give me a break, will you?" Ragnar coughed violently, trying to dislodge the remaining water in his lungs, and stammered, I come in peace." The human raised an eyebrow and gestured at the gun. "Then why the gun?" His tone shifted as recognition dawned in his eyes. "Wait, I think I remember you. You were Graco's executioner." His grip on the gun tightened as he pointed it at Ragnar. "Don't tell me you tracked us down and came here to finish me and my furry friend off." Ragnar's mind raced for an explanation, but the tangled web of events that had brought him and Izora to this planet were too complex to summarize. Every attempt to think of a coherent response ended in failure. There was simply no way to prove his innocence. Under the weight of his own weapon's gaze, Ragnar finally decided to abandon reason and speak from the heart. "Please, don't kill me," he said, his voice ragged. "Izora will be pregnant and alone in this world if I die." The human's face remained neutral, the gun unwavering. Ragnar's fear spiked. Perhaps the man was incapable of feeling empathy for a member of a species that had ruined his life. The human's finger twitched on the trigger, and Ragnar braced himself. But suddenly, the man's arm trembled, and he lowered the gun with a frustrated groan. "Fuck!" he exclaimed, turning to look into the shadows. What do you think, buddy? Is the lizard guy telling the truth?" Ragnar's eyes widened as the enormous face of the skipper emerged from the darkness. Its two glowing purple eyes and wet nose towering over both him and the human. The beast lowered its head, and its large nose came dangerously close to Ragnar, sniffing him with such force that the resulting wind made his skin turn even colder. The skipper let out a series of deep, animalistic noises, unintelligible to Ragnar, but the human simply replied, "Oh, you don't like him, but you'd have smashed him with the big rock if he was evil, is that what you mean?" The skipper nodded, a slow and firm gesture, before retreating into the shadows and laying down in the same spot it was before. Its level of intelligence left Ragnar reeling. Despite the immediate danger passing, Ragnar's uncertainty grew. He watched the human's face for some hint of what he might do next, but the alien contours of his expression were impossible to read. Finally, the human scratched his head, his fingers tangling in his black hair. "You're gonna have to do a lot of explaining if you want this gun back," he said, tucking the weapon into his belt. "In fact, I don't think anything you say will be enough." Ragnar swallowed hard and asked nervously, "Can I at least stand up first, human?" The man stepped back casually, gesturing with his hand. "Go ahead," he said. "And the name's Elias, by the way." Ragnar committed the name to memory, though his body was still stiff from the cold and the struggle. With great effort, he pushed himself to his feet, the weight of fear and the cold water leaving him shaky. When he finally stood, his surroundings seemed completely altered. The undergrowth had been flattened by the skipper's summoned flood, and previously dense vegetation now reduced to a muddy plain. The bonfire had almost entirely extinguished, leaving out faintly glowing embers, wisps of ash, and a smoldering pile of wood. Even after almost dying, Ragnar couldn't ignore the dejected look on Elias's face when he noticed the ruined chunk of meat, now lying in the mud and ash. For a moment, Ragnar considered offering this gold bar in exchange for help, but it still felt as if it was not the right time. Instead, he remembered the explanation the human had demanded. With his body trembling from the cold and the skipper's watchful gaze still unsettling him from across the clearing, Ragnar began telling the story of how he and Izora had ended up on this planet. He told Elias about his failed and brief career as an Imperial executioner, and detailed how he and Izora eloped and fled the Empire. Even with the cold still affecting him, he spoke with pride of how he stole her from Graco. Finishing his story, Ragnar chuckled. "And then we were in this place," he said through chattering teeth. "Stranded on this planet we didn't even know existed. The skippers that brought us here abandoned us when we took our first step on the ground. That wasn't a problem for you, was it, Elias? We watched you playing with them on the fields. Even the young beasts seemed to be fond of you. Not even mentioning the big guy that almost killed me with the freezing water. Can you tell me how to tame them?" His voice faded as he stared into the skipper's watchful purple eyes, leaving only the crackle of dying embers and the weight of his question hanging in the night air. Elias stared at Ragnar absently, his gaze lingering on the reptilian warrior still trembling from the cold. After a moment of silence, Elias finally said, "I can answer your question, but how about we go somewhere warmer first? Even I'm soaked in drool thanks to this big asshole over there." He jabbed an accusatory finger at the skipper, whose only response was to turn its massive head to the side, pretending as though it had nothing to do with the situation. Ragnar, still shivering, asked cautiously, "What do you mean?" Elias didn't answer, instead approaching the skipper and gesturing for Ragnar to follow. "Come on," he urged. Ragnar hesitated, struggling to understand what the human wanted. The idea of approaching the enormous black-furred creature in its home planet made his scales itch with unease. Its claws alone could rip him apart effortlessly, and since he had come to learn more about these beasts, he took tentative steps forward. His senses were on high alert, his every instinct screaming at him to flee, yet he pressed on. Elias reached out and rested one hand on the skipper's side, while placing the other firmly on Ragnar's shoulder. "All right," Elias said to the skipper. "Time to fix your mess. Take us to the hot springs, or you're eating your dinner raw tonight." Ragnar opened his mouth to argue. Surely just asking a skipper to take them somewhere wouldn't work. But the words died in his throat as the world around them began to warp. A deep purple hue bled into reality, and the air seemed to ripple like liquid. Before he could process what was happening, the distortion snapped into clarity, and they were suddenly standing in a volcanic landscape. Pools of boiling water dotted the ground, their surfaces shimmering in the intense heat. Ragnar blinked in shock, his voice shaky as he asked, "Where are we?" Elias didn't respond. He was already stripping off his wet clothes and tossing them onto the rocky ground. Without ceremony, he leapt into one of the steaming pools, submerging himself with a sigh of relief. Ragnar stood there, overwhelmed. The sudden teleportation to another world, the skipper towering behind him, and the fear that this might be a ploy to abandon him all swirled in his mind. But all that faded when Elias called out to him. "What are you waiting for? We don't have much time with clean water here. You're going to regret wasting the hot water." Ragnar frowned, confused. "Not much time with clean water?" he muttered to himself. Still, the thought of a warm bath was appealing after the freezing flood he'd endured. Needing to build trust with the human, he reluctantly approached one of the pools and dipped his tail into it. The heat was immediate and soothing, and he let out an involuntary sigh of relief. Moments later, Ragnar slid fully into the pool, submerging himself up to his neck. The warmth seeped into his scales, easing his tension. Across from him, Elias lounged casually, scrubbing the skipper drool off of his skin. Ragnar broke the silence. "How did you tame the skipper?" Elias paused mid-scrub, repeated the word tame, and then burst into uncontrollable laughter. Ragnar stared at him, bewildered, wondering if the human had finally gone mad. Finally, Elias calmed enough to speak. "There's no taming involved," he said, grinning. "The friendly asshole over there just likes to be treated as an equal. And he's got a soft spot for roasted meat. Might not look like it, but the skippers are as smart as any of us. I like to think that they're super lazy and never figured out agriculture or civilization. Perhaps because they didn't need to." Ragnar's eyes widened at the revelation, a question immediately forming in his mind. "If they're so smart, and you have this relationship with them, why are you still stranded on that planet?" Elias's grin faded, replaced by a sigh. "Because this big black furball doesn't know where Earth is," he admitted. "Every time I try and describe it, he takes me to some random planet that looks like Earth but isn't. And half the time there's something there that wants to kill us. We end up skipping realities and coming back to square one. Usually to the spot where you found my bonfire." Elias's voice carried a wry edge as he leaned back into the water, the ironic smile on his face reflecting years of frustration. Ragnar, sitting across from him, could only process the bizarre, surreal turn his night had taken, realizing just how much there was to learn about the enigmatic human and the creature he called a friend. Ragnar, still soaking in the warmth of the spring, realized this might be the best moment to ask for help. His voice was low and earnest as he spoke. "Elias, I need your help. Azora and I have gold, more than enough to share. If you can help us with the skippers and convince them to take us to a more civilized planet." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Civilized? Are you asking me to take you back to the Empire?" Ragnar shook his head in denial. "We can never return there. But I know of places, rare spots where my kind live far from Graco's influence. If we could find one of those..." Elias leaned back, considering his words. "I wouldn't mind helping," he said slowly. "But the skippers don't work like that. They can only reliably take us to places they've been before." The words struck Ragnar like a knife to the heart. The thought of raising his child on an alien planet far from his people and everything familiar clawed at him. He looked between Elias and the skipper, realizing with sinking dread that Izora's belief that taming one of these creatures would solve all their problems was nothing more than wishful thinking. Elias seemed to notice the turmoil in Ragnar's expression. After a moment of silence, he said something that made Ragnar's heart skip a beat. "Listen, Ragnar. Even before you came to me for help, I'd been thinking about something." Ragnar's full attention shifted to Elias, who stared at the rippling water. "After so many failed attempts to return to Earth," Elias continued, "I'm starting to think that my only chance of going home is by returning to the Empire and taking control of the dimensional gates from Graco." Ragnar's eyes widened in disbelief, and Elias went on. "You don't know this, but I have a young daughter on Earth. The more time I spend stranded on one random planet after another, the more of her life I miss. Her first steps, her first words. All of it." His gaze grew distant, his tone hardening. "I've always been a pacifist, Ragnar. But what your Emperor did to me, the loneliness of the wild, It's changed me. Elias placed his hand on the surface of the water, letting it drip as he raised it. All I can think about lately is asking my buddy to take me back to the Empire so I can put a bullet in Graco's head. For an instant, Ragnar felt the same desire burning inside him. If Graco were gone, his and Izora's lives would be infinitely easier. Why haven't you done that yet? He asked quietly. Elias sighed, his gaze drifting to the skipper lounging by the edge of the spring. He can't take me directly into the royal palace, and I'd have to fight through guards to reach Graco. His voice weakened. Besides, I can't ask my furred friend to go back to the place where they imprisoned him and fight for me. I'm not the only one who's a father, after all. The meaning behind Elias's words eluded Ragnar for a moment, but understanding struck much faster than he expected. The air around the spring rippled as multiple space distortions appeared, sending his instincts into high alert. Before he could react, a group of young skippers materialized, their sleek black fur shimmering in the dim volcanic light. They immediately bounded into the hot spring, splashing water everywhere as they jostled for space around Elias. Though smaller than the adult, each of them were still large enough to disturb the water and spread mud everywhere in their chaotic play. Elias laughed, standing up and stepping out of the spring. See? I told you we wouldn't enjoy the hot water for long. Ragnar was mesmerized by the sight of the young skippers. These beings, with their reality-bending powers, looked playful and much friendlier than their massive parents. Yet the adult skipper's gaze remained locked on Ragnar, a silent warning that the privilege of his trust and play with the young did not extend to him, and was just for Elias. As time passed, Ragnar felt increasingly excluded. The young skippers demanded all of Elias's attention, their antics dominating the moment. Only when the creatures grew bored and retreated to the adult skipper's side did Ragnar finally find an opening. He approached Elias cautiously. You and I have a goal in common, he began. To return to our species, we have to eliminate Graco. Elias looked contemplative, his dark eyes studying Ragnar carefully. Just the two of us wouldn't be enough, he said bluntly. Ragnar nodded, desperation in his voice. Izora and I know the Empire inside and out. If we had a way to travel between planets and a safe place to regroup, we could help you gather weapons, resources, and allies. One day, we could have what we need to face Graco. Please, Elias. We need your help if we ever want to return home. Ragnar lowered his head, his pride swallowed by his request. Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, a wide grin spread across his face. He extended his hand. All right, Ragnar. Extend your hand. Without hesitation, Ragnar obeyed. Elias clasped his hands firmly and shook it. This is a human custom, Elias explained, the grin still on his face. It means we have a deal.